Last episode, we covered the death of Gloria Satterfield and the fall of Alex Murdaugh. Could Alex's actions be tied to the murder of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh? It's definitely possible, but there's even more to this story that needs to be covered. Let's revisit a statement that Alex put out 2 days after he set up his failed suicide for hire attempt. I'm resigning from my law firm and entering rehab after a long battle that has been exacerbated by these murders. I ask for prayers as I rehabilitate myself and my relationships. So Alex claims that he has been battling an opioid addiction, and his lawyer later says it's been a 20-year battle. Was this just a personal drug addiction, or was Alex involved with drugs in a larger capacity? And could this personal addiction be a front for something much bigger? Maybe if we look at the history of drugs in this area, we can get a better idea of the likelihood of it. Before we dive in, I want to say thank you to my patrons. Without them, this wouldn't be possible. If you're interested in seeing early releases of my episodes, as well as vlogs and extended cuts of interviews, you can check out my Patreon below. The recommended cost is $5 per month, but I set up the payment to pay what you can so that viewers going through financial difficulties can join for as little as $1 per month. Back to the story. Before drugs were the illegal choice of substance in the area, it was alcohol. The 18th Amendment banning the production, transportation, and importation of alcohol went into effect in January of 1920 and fueled illegal bootlegging all over the country. Seeing that the violence and underground production and distribution of alcohol actually had worse side effects than legalized alcohol, the U.S. government ended the prohibition in December of 1933. But bootlegging didn't die with prohibition, and South Carolina's heavy taxes on alcohol left incentive for bootleggers to stay in business. Interestingly enough, as recently as 2018, there have been busts on illegal stills hidden in the backwoods of rural South Carolina. But to see how all of this applies to this story, we need to go back to 1956, when Randolph Murdaugh Jr., aka Buster, was the solicitor. It's often talked about how the Murdaughs were solicitors from 1920 until 2005, but there's actually a small caveat to that. In 1956, Buster Murdaugh was forced to step down for a short period of time. This Department of Justice bulletin, dated November 9th, 1956, details how, quote, in June of 1956, a federal grand jury returned an indictment charging Randolph Buster Murdaugh and 27 other defendants with having conspired over a period of several years to violate the Internal Revenue liquor laws. Attempts were made to influence them by promises of reward for themselves or members of their family, and at least one attempt was made to intimidate or influence the United States Attorney. Although acquitted, Solicitor Murdaugh was publicly castigated for his unethical practices by Judge Hoffman. So Buster Murdaugh was allegedly working with bootleggers, tipping them off and essentially doing fake raids of stills, creating a facade of a crackdown on illegal bootlegging. This could be an isolated event, but it does set a precedence for the Murdaughs being involved with illegal substances. In 1979, the largest marijuana bust in American history at the time occurred in the same waters Paul Murdaugh and friends were cruising around in just a few years ago. 4 shrimpers were caught by the Coast Guard smuggling tons of marijuana into the St. Helena Sound. Government-led Operation Jackpot revealed how many educated members of the Low Country had ties to drug smuggling, and many of those people and families are still in the area to this day. Smuggling marijuana into the Low Country might be different than you would think. They were known as gentlemen smugglers because they were more like Southern hippies than hardcore drug smugglers. Here's a quote from Jason Ryan, who wrote the book called Jackpot: High Times, High Seas, and the Sting That Launched the War on Drugs. Nowadays, we take for granted that violence accompanies all types of drug trafficking. But back in the 70s, these smugglers reasoned that there was plenty of money to go around, and it was as much about the fun as it was the money. So there was no reason to carry a gun. There's no changing what happened, Ryan says, and I think they don't believe they were wrong. They were simply out to have a good time, and they weren't bothering anyone in their eyes. The Beaufort-Port Royal area was, and many areas still are, pretty undeveloped. Shrimping was also booming, and the sheer number of shrimp boats going in and out of the area made it easy to blend in. South Carolina in general was a great place to smuggle drugs because it had 3 ports: the Port of Georgetown, the Port of Charleston, and Port Royal. In 1997, for example, 274,000 tons of goods were imported through the Port Royal docks. You can actually see the bridge where the boating accident occurred from the docks at Port Royal. Smuggling was prevalent in the area into the 80s. For example, in 1983, a boat out of Beaufort named the Janine Ann was seized along with 843 bales of marijuana, totaling 15 tons. The ship was named after the wife of shrimper Barrett Thomas Bowler. Bowler, along with his father, was charged with conspiracy to possess marijuana with intent to distribute and conspiracy to import marijuana. This article details how charges were dropped against Barrett Thomas Bowler, 27, and his father, Barrett Bowler, both of Allendale, after a key government witness was killed when he stepped in front of a car in Florida. About 5 months ago, it was first discovered by crime sleuths in a few Facebook groups that Alex bought the property Moselle from some family friends of his, Barrett T. Bowler's wife, Janine Ann, for $5. The sleuths also discovered that Alex and Barrett co-owned multiple properties together, many of them small islands only accessible by boat on the coastal waterways of South Carolina. Alex also bought property from Barrett for a business he went into. Knowing the alleged past of Barrett's family, it was easy for the Facebook groups and myself to begin to speculate that these islands could be used to smuggle drugs, maybe as drop-off points or lookouts. From early on, even as I was making my very first episode, I had a hunch that the deaths of Paul and Maggie were drug-related, so when these connections were posted, it just made sense. A few months ago, Will Folks and his team at Fitz News reported on a jelly ball operation that Alex was a part of back in the early 2010s. Jelly balls are a delicacy in China and are worth up to 50 cents a jelly ball. I took this video from my boat a few years ago when the water was saturated with them. Jelly balling is very similar to shrimping. Alex went into business with another attorney at his firm, Ronnie Crosby, and his friend Barrett T. Bowler. The business plan was to offload the jelly balls here off of Jenkins Creek and transport them to a facility in Islandton, the same area Moselle was in, for processing. Again, it's not hard to imagine this being a front for smuggling. Precedence has been set in the area for this type of activity. This operation ended up having a few hiccups though. For one, the docks off of Jenkins Creek were right next to a residential area, and the noise of the trucks driving out late at night disturbed the neighbors. In addition, when these jelly balls are distressed, they release a toxic mucus. Upon inspection, the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control determined that they needed additional permits to rinse and dispose of this toxic mucus. The operation was shut down in 2014. That wasn't the end of Barrett and Alex's relationship though. When Barrett became sick in 2018, he signed a power of attorney over to Alex, giving him power over his assets. Barrett passed away from cancer that same year at the age of 61. As I alluded at the end of my last episode, my original plan with this one was to show the potential progression of the Murdaugh family being involved with illegal alcohol, to marijuana, to opioids. This marijuana section was kind of difficult. I spent hours poring over info and property records, but at the time of recording this, I couldn't find any real evidence that Alex was involved in smuggling. Sure, there are things that have been found that could be explained by smuggling drugs, but they could just as easily, or even more easily, be explained by completely non-nefarious and normal activity. I think I realized something really important while working on this episode. I wanted there to be some crazy drug smuggling operation that Alex was at the center of. It would make for an incredibly interesting story, a story that I would really enjoy diving into and telling. It makes for a story that would get tons of views. I'm really glad I had this realization, as it's something I need to look out for in the future. If I'm going to tell an accurate and honest story, wanting a certain narrative to be true isn't going to help me accomplish that goal. It's going to taint my research and the way that I present things, and I'm glad I caught it. Once I had this realization of bias, I stepped back and tried to take a look at everything again with fresh eyes. To be clear, I don't know for a fact that Alex and Barrett weren't smuggling drugs into the area, but if there were other explanations, I wanted to present those as possibilities as well. And I did find other explanations, as well as things in the drug smuggling theory that just don't quite make sense to me. First, let's take a look at how the area has changed since Barrett was allegedly smuggling. Due to various regulations, shrimping in the area has declined greatly. Here's a quote from one of the last remaining shrimpers in the area. Where we used to pack 150 to 200 boxes a night, now we might be packing 10. In addition, the docks at Port Royal were shut down in 2004, leaving the Port of Charleston and Georgetown as locations for import in South Carolina. Smugglers no longer have the cover of so much activity in and out of this area. Next, let's take a look at the properties. This is where the islands are located that could be used as lookouts, and this is the outlet to the ocean. The properties on the water that could be used to offload drugs are located over here, with the outlet to the ocean going on this route. The islands that they owned couldn't be used as lookout spots to offload drugs on Jenkins Creek. It wouldn't make sense. There was another property on Village Creek, but when I went there, I could clearly see it so far up the creek, there's no way a boat of any size would be able to get to it, and I doubt they were using canoes to run thousands of pounds of drugs. Then I thought through the concept of using these islands as lookouts. First, many of them are not accessible. A dock would need to be built to access them. Second, using these islands as lookouts would be incredibly inefficient. Let's look at this island for example. It's split into 4 lots. Alex and Barrett owned the outside 2 lots with no houses on them. So would these lookout guys take a boat out to this island and walk down a dock that they don't own, stand on this little piece of land with a pair of binoculars? Keep in mind, you can see much less from down there than you can from the drone. Why wouldn't they just send the lookout guys on boats pretending to fish? This seems like a much more efficient, flexible, and cost-effective option than spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on stationary islands to use as lookout spots. So why would they own these islands? I know a family who manages a fish camp on an island less than a mile from the ones owned by Alex and Barrett, so I've been out to that area before in my boat and on friends' boats. I would love to own one of these. For people who love this area, the outdoors, fishing, these are great spots. One reason is you can spend a few days fishing offshore without having to take your boat in and out of the water every time. Just pull up to your little island, tie off the boat, relax, have a few drinks, get up the next day, and go back out. I mentioned in my first episode that this area feels like our own little corner of undiscovered America. While this could make it a good spot to smuggle drugs, in my opinion, it also makes it a good spot to buy investment property. As this area is discovered by more and more people, the property values will go up. And there's a limited number of these little islands. You can't just make more. Let's take a look at the Jelly Ball Company. I think it's important to remember when talking about smuggling in this area back in the day that those involved were shrimpers first. An opportunity came along for them to use their business to make a lot of money illegally, and many of them took it. But they weren't drug smugglers that got into shrimping. They were shrimpers who got into smuggling. So when a family of shrimpers starts a jelly ball business, it just kind of makes sense. There were a lot of transactions associated with the business, and some did look odd. For example, when the business closed, the LLCs sold the property back to Ronnie Crosby for $5. But I couldn't find any transactions that couldn't be easily explained by using loopholes to avoid taxes. I'm not saying it's right or that they should have done it, but these examples are way more easily explained by tax avoidance than drug smuggling. A really interesting theory did come to me after kind of stepping back and looking at all this. We know that Alex was allegedly involved in conning many of his clients out of money. Based off of the evidence we have, I believe he was a grifter and a con man who would insert himself into situations when he saw an opportunity to take advantage of someone. What if he was taking advantage of Barrett too? This could explain the Moselle situation and the power of attorney. Maybe he positioned himself as the attorney friend there to help Barrett and his family, but actually had much less generous motives. Lastly, one thing that I can't quite figure out is where did all of Alex's money go? We know that he allegedly brought in a substantial amount of money through taking advantage of his clients, over $8 million, and we can't account for where all of that went. If he was smuggling drugs into the area, he wouldn't be spending all of his money on that, he'd be making more money from that. This would make the question of where did all the money go even more perplexing. Looking at the property records, LLCs, and transactions, it would be easy to speculate that Alex was attempting to launder the money that he took from clients, and I think that's a very real possibility. At the end of researching for this section, I was still left scratching my head a bit. These property transactions, businesses, and relationships could mean numerous things, and to be honest, I'm not sure where the truth lies. At the time of recording this, Alec hasn't been to trial yet, so hopefully when he goes, we'll finally get some answers. Let's take a look at this article from Bluffton Today about opioid use in Hampton County, South Carolina. In 2006, 553,300 pain pills were sent to Hampton County pharmacies and physicians. In 2012, the county received 824,860 pills, an increase of 49% in 7 years. Manufacturers saturated towns with more painkillers than reasonably could be used for medical purposes. And so the pills were diverted to the black market and abused. When access to medical-grade opioids was cut off amid crackdowns and public pressure, people had to switch to street opiates like heroin to prevent debilitating withdrawal. In November of 2021, the Island Packet reported on a connection that Alec had with a gang out of the neighboring small town of Walterboro. According to a source close to the investigation, Alec was fueling his opioid addiction through this gang. The gang called themselves the Cowboys. This 2017 article by ABC4 News details how 8 members of the gang were sentenced to prison for various charges related to multiple attempted murders and illegal drug activity. So what's the connection with Alec? Apparently, he was buying drugs from them through Curtis Eddie Smith, the same man who was involved in the attempted suicide last year, and he was doing it with checks. We'll dive into those checks more in the next episode. Alec's connection with the Walterboro Cowboys is kind of unclear. The news outlets that reported on it just say they got this information from, quote, sources familiar with the investigation. We don't know any more about the connection or how credible this source really is, but while working on this episode, I thought back to an interview I listened to while combing through the police interviews in the Stephen Smith case. It was a guy named Ben, who was one of the people the officer spoke with when trying to track down the source of the Buster rumor. At one point, he brings up Moselle and how it was known as the place where the kids would go for alcohol and drug-fueled parties.
The Murdaughs, they threw and they had big parties at their house. Yeah. Once again, that was something I was never part of. I think I went out there one time, but they threw parties every weekend, every other weekend, big parties, kids from Wade Hampton, kids from Barnwell, Bamberg, anywhere you could think of. I mean, that was where the party spot was in Hampton. Yeah. A lot of fights, alcohol, drugs kind of thrown in there all at the same time. And when I originally heard this, I was thinking of the younger Murdaugh boy, Buster's little brother Paul. So when I first heard it was Buster, it kind of caught me off guard because he's never been that type of person. But then again, like I say, once with alcohol and drugs, I'm sure things can go way out of control when you mix all that together. Yeah.
Based off what I know, it's my opinion that Alec was, at the very least, complicit when it came to underage kids and consuming drugs and alcohol out at Moselle. And it wouldn't be hard to speculate that he was not only complicit, but was aiding in providing these drugs and alcohol. In addition, I received a tip from someone who went to high school with Paul and claimed that Alec wasn't the only Murdaugh who was using opioids, but Paul was too. There's one bit of information that I'm not really sure how to include or if it means anything at all, but as drugs become a bigger part of this story, I felt maybe I should include it. I paid $500 for the FOIA request for the Stephen Smith case, so I have everything the police are releasing on it. In the hours of interviews I listened to, there are a few names redacted, maybe 2 seconds of audio here and there, but there's one section where a solid 10 seconds are redacted. He does mention someone's name right after the redacted portion, but for their privacy, I'll be redacting that name and putting a substitute name in the subtitles.
Buster and maybe 1 or 2 other people.
And he didn't say who?
He didn't say who. He did not say who, but I do know at a party at the Murdaugh's house in Moselle that recently just moved to Oklahoma. It's just weird to me, you know, all this is, and it could be a very strange coincidence, but it's just weird to me, you know. Mm-hmm. And I do know that he was bad on drugs of, you know, marijuana, cocaine, things of that nature. Mm-hmm. So it's a very strange coincidence.
So who is Tony, and why was a larger section of this interview redacted? I didn't include this in my Stephen Smith episodes because there were so many other theories that had much more supporting evidence, and I couldn't find any other info on this Tony guy. Sometimes things are redacted because it gives police the upper hand when only they have the info and the perpetrator of the crime doesn't know what they know. That's why so little about the Paul and Maggie investigation has been made public. Could Tony have been involved in the death of Stephen Smith? It's possible, but part of me wonders if that 10 seconds of redacted audio was redacted for the sake of the Paul and Maggie investigation, not the Stephen Smith investigation. We talked about numerous possibilities in this episode. I don't know where the truth lies, but I hope all of the avenues are being investigated thoroughly. It's been over 9 months since the murders of Paul and Maggie, and it's starting to look like we might never get answers. So could drugs have played a part in the murder of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh? Alec's been writing checks to Curtis Eddie Smith for a few years, most for amounts under $10,000. The largest check he wrote to Eddie was the last check he gave him. It was for $22,109. And it was written just 10 days before the murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh. Next episode, we'll dive into how Alec's financial crimes and relationship to drugs could have resulted in the murder of Paul and Maggie. Love you guys. I'll see y'all in episode 8.